Nadine Holloway had learned long ago that silence was not emptiness. It was a room with walls thick enough to hold the weight of observation, strategy, and patience. She had cultivated this understanding from her father, a man who had built an empire not through shouting or spectacle, but through the quiet accumulation of knowledge and the careful timing of action. And now, standing in the bathroom of the Grand Ballroom at the Monarch Hotel in Atlanta, adjusting the pearl necklace she had worn on her wedding day 15 years ago, she understood that tonight would require every lesson he had ever taught her. Through the walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of guests arriving for her anniversary celebration. 200 people, colleagues of her husband, business associates, family members she rarely saw, all of them gathering to celebrate 15 years of a marriage that had become, in Marcus Holloway's careful construction, a monument to his success and her supporting role in it. Nadine studied her reflection. 42 years old, skin the color of warm mahogany, hair pulled back in a simple twist, a dress she had purchased from a consignment shop 3 years ago, elegant in its simplicity but unremarkable in its price. She had chosen it deliberately, as she had chosen so many things in her marriage deliberately to test a theory she had hoped would prove false. The theory had proven true. She heard her phone vibrate against the marble counter, a text from her father. "We're in the lobby. Your mother sends her love. We're ready when you are." Nadine typed back, "Soon." She allowed herself one more moment of stillness, one more breath before she walked back into the performance of her life, the performance she would end tonight in a manner Marcus could never have anticipated. 15 years ago, Nadine Yolanda Brooks had met Marcus Holloway at a community fundraiser in Decatur. She had been 27, recently returned from completing her MBA at Northwestern, quietly working in her father's real estate development company in a position that appeared, to outside observers, to be administrative. This was by design. Elijah Brooks had built Brooks and Associates from a single duplex he purchased in 1985 into a portfolio that now included commercial properties, residential developments, and strategic investments worth, at last accounting, $437 million. He had done this without fanfare, without his name on buildings, without the ostentatious displays of wealth that might draw unwanted attention or resentment. "Money talks," he had told Nadine when she was 16. "But wisdom whispers, and wisdom always wins." Nadine had inherited both his discretion and his instinct for reading people. When Marcus approached her at that fundraiser, handsome in his confidence, articulate in his ambition, she had felt the familiar flutter of attraction. But she had also felt the small, cautious voice of her father's training, asking her to watch before she decided. Marcus was a rising associate at a commercial real estate firm called Henderson and Locke. He was charismatic, driven, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made people feel seen without requiring him to truly see them. Within minutes of their first conversation, Nadine understood that he was performing for her, projecting an image of success and stability that he believed would impress a woman he had assessed, quickly and superficially, as someone from a modest background. She had not corrected him. This was her first test. She wanted to know if Marcus Holloway would love her for who she was, not for what her family possessed. She wanted to know if his interest would deepen when he learned she drove a 10-year-old Honda, lived in a small apartment in East Atlanta, and dressed in clothes that were functional rather than flashy. She wanted to know if his ambition included room for a partner or merely a prop. For the first 2 years, Marcus passed these tests. He courted her with attention and consistency. He introduced her to his mother, a retired school teacher in Macon, who welcomed Nadine with genuine warmth. He spoke of building a future together, of starting a family, of creating something meaningful. And when he proposed in a small restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, Nadine had believed him. She had told him then about her family's company. She had explained that her father was successful in real estate, that she worked for the family business, that there was wealth she had not previously disclosed. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, looking for the flicker of recalculation she feared. What she saw was more subtle, not greed, exactly, something closer to relief. As if a piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in his mind had finally clicked into place. "I always knew there was something special about you," he said. "This explains it." It did not occur to him, Nadine noted, to ask why she had kept this from him. It did not occur to him to wonder what it meant about his own transparency, his own tests. They married 6 months later. Nadine's father, Elijah, performed his own assessment of Marcus during the engagement. He did not share his conclusions with his daughter directly, respecting her adulthood and her choices, but he did make one request. "Keep the prenuptial agreement simple," he said. "Protect what existed before the marriage, but watch what develops during it. A person reveals themselves not in the ceremony, but in the years that follow." Nadine had followed his advice. The prenuptial agreement was straightforward. Assets brought into the marriage remained separate property. Assets acquired during the marriage would be divided equitably in the event of divorce. It was standard, unremarkable, and Marcus had signed it without objection, confident in his own ability to accumulate wealth independently. What Marcus did not know, and what Nadine's father had quietly arranged, was that the prenuptial agreement was a minor document compared to the larger architecture of the Brooks family trust. Nadine was the sole beneficiary of a trust valued at over $120 million, structured to protect her interests in any marital outcome. The trust owned the company. The company owned properties, investments, and, through a series of holding entities, a significant stake in the very firm where Marcus Holloway now worked as a senior partner. Henderson and Locke had been acquired quietly and completely by a Brooks subsidiary 4 years ago. Marcus had celebrated the acquisition as a sign of his firm's growing prestige, never questioning the identity of the new parent company. The entity name on the paperwork was bland, bureaucratic, designed to attract no attention. Yolanda Holdings, LLC, Nadine's middle name, her father's small joke, and his insurance policy. For 15 years, Nadine had watched her husband change. The shift was gradual, like the movement of tectonic plates, imperceptible in any single moment, but devastating in its cumulative effect. The first 5 years had been comfortable, even happy at times. Marcus worked long hours, building his career, and Nadine supported him, managing their household, raising their twin sons, Elijah Jr. and David, and continuing her quiet work at her father's company. They attended church together on Sundays. They took family vacations to modest destinations, beaches in Florida, national parks, the occasional trip to visit his mother in Macon. But around year 6, something shifted. Marcus made partner at Henderson and Locke. His income increased substantially, and with that increase came a new set of expectations about what their life should look like. "We should move to Buckhead," he announced one evening over dinner. "Our house is fine, but it's not the kind of address that impresses clients." Nadine had considered this. "I like our neighborhood. The boys have friends here. The schools are good." Marcus had looked at her with an expression she would come to know well, a mixture of patience and condescension, as if he were explaining something obvious to someone who simply could not understand. "It's about perception, Nadine. You wouldn't get it. You've never had to build something from nothing." She did not point out that her father had built an empire from a single duplex. She did not mention that she managed a portfolio of community development projects, that had revitalized 3 struggling neighborhoods in Atlanta. She simply nodded and returned to her dinner, filing the comment away in the growing catalog of observations she was assembling. They moved to Buckhead. Marcus selected the house without consulting her, a 6-bedroom colonial that required extensive renovation. The costs spiraled beyond his projections. Quietly, without telling him, Nadine arranged for her father's company to purchase the mortgage from the original lender. The Holloways now made their payments unknowingly to Yolanda Holdings. Year 8 brought Marcus's first affair. Nadine discovered it not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small inconsistencies. Late nights that grew later, business trips that extended longer, a shift in his attention, a distraction in his eyes, a new carefulness about his phone. She did not confront him. She observed. She documented. She waited. The affair ended after 7 months. Marcus returned to her with renewed attention, gifts she did not need, apologies wrapped in justifications. "Work has been stressful," he explained. "I lost myself for a while. But I'm back now. I'm committed." Nadine accepted his words. She did not accept his meaning. She understood now that Marcus Holloway viewed their marriage as a contract whose terms he could unilaterally renegotiate when convenient. Year 10 brought the twins' acceptance to an elite private school. The tuition was significant, and Marcus suggested that Nadine ask her father for assistance. "Your family has money," he said. "It makes sense." "My family's money is my family's business," Nadine replied. "We can afford the tuition from our income." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Your income, you mean? From your little job at your father's company?" Nadine did not rise to the bait. "From our household income, which is substantial." "It's not about substance, it's about contribution. I bring in the real money. You play at working." She let the words settle between them like stones dropped in still water. She watched the ripples of his contempt spread and fade, and she added this moment to her catalog. By year 12, Marcus had stopped pretending. His comments about her cheap habits, her simple tastes, her lack of ambition became a regular feature of their conversations. He criticized her clothing, her car, her reluctance to display the wealth he believed he had earned. He introduced her at firm events with barely concealed embarrassment, positioning himself as a self-made man shackled to a wife who did not appreciate what he had built. "This is my wife, Nadine," he would say. "She keeps things grounded." The pause before grounded carried the weight of his true meaning: limited, unambitious. Beneath him. Nadine smiled through these introductions. She shook hands with colleagues and clients. She listened to their conversations, noted their politics, observed the architecture of her husband's professional relationships. She was building her own understanding, her own map of his world. Year 14 brought the second affair. This one was different, more serious, more sustained. A woman named Veronica Tate, an interior designer Marcus had hired to redecorate his office. Nadine discovered them together at a restaurant in Midtown, seated in a corner booth with the intimacy of established lovers rather than the furtiveness of new ones. She did not approach their table. She photographed them from across the room, returned to her car, and drove home. That evening, when Marcus returned late with another excuse about client dinners, she served him the meal she had prepared and asked about his day. "Long," he said. "Exhausting? You wouldn't understand." "No," she agreed. "I probably wouldn't." That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Nadine went to his study. She had long known the password to his computer. He had never thought to hide it from a wife he considered too simple to be curious. She spent 3 hours reviewing his emails, his files, his financial records. What she found was worse than infidelity. Marcus was planning to leave her. Not in the emotional sense, he had left her years ago, but in the legal sense. He had been working with a divorce attorney for 6 months, building a case for a dissolution that would maximize his share of their marital assets, while minimizing what he would owe her. His strategy was comprehensive. He had documented her spending habits, modest though they were, as evidence of financial irresponsibility. He had characterized her work at her father's company as a no-show job, with no real responsibilities. He had begun quietly transferring portions of their joint investments into accounts she did not know existed, and he had drafted a narrative in which he was the long-suffering provider, trapped in a marriage to a woman who contributed nothing. The file was labeled Exit Strategy. Nadine read every document. She photographed every page. She noted every account number, every transfer, every lie. And then she closed the laptop, returned to bed, and lay awake until morning, her mind as still and deep as a lake in winter. The next day, she called her father. "I need to talk to you," she said. "In person. It's about Marcus." Elijah Brooks met his daughter at his office in downtown Atlanta. At 71, he remained sharp and vigorous, a man who had survived Jim Crow, built a business through recessions and recoveries, and navigated the complexities of wealth with the same quiet competence he applied to everything. He listened to his daughter's account without interruption, his face betraying nothing. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want justice," Nadine said. "But I want it done right. I want him to understand exactly what he threw away, and I want to be free." Her father nodded. "Then we'll need a plan, and we'll need Vanessa." Vanessa Clark was a family attorney who had worked with the Brooks family for 20 years. She specialized in complex marital dissolutions, particularly those involving high net worth individuals and concealed assets. She was also Nadine's godmother, a woman who had known her since infancy and loved her like a daughter. The three of them met the following week. Nadine brought copies of everything she had found. Vanessa reviewed the documents with professional thoroughness, her expression growing colder with each page. "He's been sloppy," she said finally. "Arrogant. He thinks you don't know, and he thinks you wouldn't understand even if you did. That's good for us. It means he's left trails." "What do I do?" Nadine asked. Vanessa leaned forward. "You do nothing visible. You continue as you have been. You let him believe his plan is proceeding. Meanwhile, we trace every dollar he's moved. We document every lie. We build a record so complete that when the time comes, there will be no room for dispute." "And the affair?" "Evidence of bad faith. It strengthens your position in the divorce. Georgia courts consider adultery when determining alimony and asset division, but more importantly, it reveals his character. It shows pattern." Nadine nodded. "How long?" "Months, perhaps until your anniversary. The party he's planning. It would be a fitting moment for revelation if you're comfortable with public exposure." Nadine thought about this. 15 years of marriage, 200 guests, her husband standing before them, celebrating a partnership he had secretly worked to dissolve. "Yes," she said, "the anniversary will be perfect." The months that followed required a performance Nadine had not known she was capable of delivering. She continued her life with Marcus as if nothing had changed. She prepared dinners. She attended his firm events. She listened to his criticisms and his condescension with the same patient expression she had always worn. But beneath the surface, she was working. She met with Vanessa weekly, reviewing the evidence they were accumulating. Marcus's financial transfers were more extensive than she had initially realized. Over $300,000 moved to offshore accounts, hidden investments in properties she had never heard of, debts concealed from their joint filings. "He's been building a parallel life," Vanessa explained. One he can step into the moment the divorce is finalized. He's planned this for years. And Veronica Tate, she knows about the money. We have emails suggesting she's expecting to benefit from his new start. She doesn't know about you, though. She thinks you're oblivious. Nadine smiled without warmth. She's not the only one. As the anniversary approached, Nadine took additional steps. She quietly moved her own protected assets beyond any possible reach of the divorce proceedings. She ensured that her father's company documentation was in perfect order, ready to demonstrate the true ownership structure of Yolanda Holdings if necessary. And she prepared a series of documents that Marcus would receive at the party, not just divorce papers, but a comprehensive accounting of everything she knew, everything he had done, and everything he stood to lose. The guest list for the anniversary party had been Marcus's project. He had approached it with the same strategic calculation he applied to everything, inviting not people who cared about their marriage, but people who could advance his career, partners from his firm, potential clients, social contacts who might prove useful, his mother dutifully included, but seated at a table far from the action, Nadine's parents tolerated as necessary appendages to the event. Nadine had added only one name to the list, David Kirkland, a friend from business school who now worked as a forensic accountant. Marcus did not know that David had spent the past 2 months reviewing the documentation Vanessa had compiled, preparing a report that detailed every fraudulent transfer, every concealed asset, every violation of their marital financial agreements. The report was in Nadine's purse now, in the bathroom of the Monarch Hotel, waiting for the moment it would be needed. She heard a knock at the door. "Mrs. Holloway," a staff member's voice. "Your husband is asking for you. The guests are assembled." Nadine took one more breath. She adjusted her pearls. She walked to the door and opened it. "Thank you," she said. "I'm ready." The ballroom was magnificent, a testament to Marcus's insistence that their anniversary be a display of success. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across tables set with white linens and gold accents. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres, and at the center of it all stood Marcus Holloway, resplendent in a tailored suit, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent his life convincing others of his worth. Nadine moved through the room with quiet purpose, accepting congratulations, nodding at faces familiar and unfamiliar, making her way toward the table where her parents sat with Vanessa and her husband. Her mother rose, squeezed her hand as she approached. "You look beautiful, baby," Rose whispered, "and you look ready." "I am," Nadine replied. She sat between her parents, watching Marcus work the room. He was in his element, charming, expansive, performing the role of successful husband for an audience that neither knew nor questioned the truth beneath the surface. After an hour of mingling, Marcus moved to the small stage where the band had set up. He tapped a microphone, calling for attention, and the room gradually quieted. "Thank you all for being here," he began. 15 years, that's a long time. Long enough to really know someone. Long enough to understand what works and what doesn't in a partnership. Nadine watched him, her face composed, her hands folded in her lap. "When I met Nadine, I was just starting out. An associate at a firm, working my way up from nothing. She was—" He paused, as if searching for the right word. "Simple, uncomplicated. The kind of woman who doesn't need much, doesn't ask for much. I thought that was a gift." A few guests chuckled politely, uncertain of his tone. "Over the years, I've built something, a career, a reputation, a life that means something, and I did it while being stuck with a wife who never understood ambition, who drove the same car for years because she couldn't see why it mattered, who dressed like she was going to a church potluck instead of a firm event, who never once tried to match what I was building. The laughter had stopped. The room was very still. My cheap wife, Marcus continued, his smile hardening. That's what the guys at work call her, Marcus's cheap wife. And you know what? They're right. 15 years, and I'm still waiting for her to understand what success looks like. Nadine felt her mother's hand tighten on her arm. She saw her father begin to rise from his seat, his face set in an expression she had seen only a few times in her life, the expression of a man who had calculated every variable and was now ready to act. "If I may," Elijah Brooks said, his voice carrying across the room with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to shout. Marcus looked startled. "Elijah, of course. Did you want to say something?" "I did." Elijah walked toward the stage, his movements unhurried, his gaze steady. "I wanted to talk about my daughter, about that cheap wife you mentioned." Marcus's smile flickered. "It was a joke, Elijah, just a little humor." "Humor." Elijah reached the stage and turned to face the audience. "Let me tell you about humor, and let me tell you about value." He paused, letting the silence build. "When my daughter was 27 years old, she came to work for our family business, not as an heiress, not as a princess. She started in our community development division, working 12-hour days to transform neighborhoods that developers had abandoned. She built relationships with contractors, with city officials, with families who had given up hope. Within 5 years, she had overseen projects that revitalized 3 communities and generated returns that exceeded anything I had projected." Marcus's face had gone pale. "She did this while driving a 10-year-old Honda, while living in a modest apartment, while wearing clothes she bought secondhand because she believed money should serve purpose, not vanity. She did this because I raised her to understand that wealth is a tool, not an identity." Elijah turned to look directly at his son-in-law. "You called her your cheap wife. You mocked her in front of 200 people. You built your little speech around the assumption that she was someone you had outgrown, someone beneath your success. So let me correct your understanding." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder. "This is the ownership structure of Yolanda Holdings, LLC, my daughter's middle name, in case you'd forgotten. Yolanda Holdings is the parent company of Brooks and Associates. Brooks and Associates owns, among other things, a 53% stake in the firm you work for, Henderson and Locke. We acquired it 4 years ago." The room had become absolutely silent. Marcus stood frozen, the microphone still in his hand. "That cheap wife you mocked? She owns your company. She owns the building you work in. She owns the mortgage on your house. She has owned these things for years, and she never once asked you to kneel or grovel or thank her, because she was testing something. She wanted to know if you loved her or if you loved what you thought she could become. She gave you 15 years to pass that test." Elijah's voice dropped, becoming quieter, more dangerous. "You failed." He handed the folder to Marcus, who took it reflexively, his hands trembling. "But that's not all. Nadine, would you like to explain the rest?" Nadine rose from her seat and walked toward the stage. Every eye in the room followed her. When she reached Marcus, she stood before him with her hands clasped, her expression as calm as if she were discussing the weather. "6 months ago," she said, "I discovered that you were planning to divorce me. I found your files, your exit strategy, your emails with your attorney, your communications with Veronica Tate." A gasp rippled through the room. Several guests turned to look at a woman near the back, a woman with auburn hair and an expensive dress, who was now rising from her seat, her face stricken. "I know about the $300,000 you transferred to offshore accounts. I know about the property you purchased in Veronica's name in Savannah." I know about the debt you concealed from our joint filings. I have documentation of every lie, every theft, every betrayal." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. "These are divorce papers. You'll find they include a full accounting of your financial misconduct, prepared by a forensic accountant who has worked with our family for years. They also include documentation of your adultery, which Georgia courts consider when determining asset division and alimony." Marcus's mouth opened, but no words emerged. "You will not contest these papers," Nadine continued. "You will not drag this through the courts. You will sign them, you will accept the terms, and you will walk away quietly. If you do not, the report in your hands will be shared with the state bar, with your firm's ethics committee, and with every client you've spent the last 15 years cultivating. Your career will end, your reputation will be destroyed, and you will spend the next decade in litigation you cannot afford and cannot win." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over him. "I gave you 15 years to see me, to value me, to treat me as a partner instead of an accessory. You chose mockery, you chose theft, you chose betrayal. This is the consequence." She turned and began to walk away, then stopped and looked back. "By the way, I've already had the locks changed at the house. Your belongings have been packed and delivered to your mother's address in Macon. She's expecting you. I told her you needed some time to think about the choices you've made." The envelope remained extended. Marcus, his face ashen, finally took it. Nadine returned to her seat, where her mother embraced her, and her father nodded with quiet pride. Around them, the room had erupted into murmurs and whispered conversations. Marcus stood alone on the stage, divorce papers in one hand and ownership documents in the other, the architecture of his lies collapsing around him in front of every person he had spent his career trying to impress. Veronica Tate had already fled the room. Several partners from Henderson and Locke were conferring urgently in a corner. Marcus's mother sat with her head bowed, her hands clasped in prayer. After several minutes, Marcus walked off the stage without another word. He moved through the room like a man underwater, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his face emptied of its former confidence. He did not look at Nadine as he passed. He did not speak to anyone. He simply walked out of the ballroom, through the hotel lobby, and into the night. The party, such as it was, came to a quiet end. Guests departed with murmured condolences and awkward congratulations, uncertain which was appropriate. The waiters cleared the tables, the band packed their instruments, and gradually the room emptied until only Nadine's family and Vanessa remained. They sat together at one of the abandoned tables, the debris of celebration around them. "How do you feel?" Rose asked, taking her daughter's hand. Nadine considered the question. The anger she had carried for months, the cold determination that had fueled her preparation. These had not disappeared exactly, but they had transformed into something else, something quieter, something that felt unexpectedly like relief. "Free," she said finally. "I feel free." Elijah nodded. That was the goal. Vanessa leaned forward. "The legal process will take time, but his position is untenable. He'll sign. He has no choice." "I know," Nadine said. "I'm not worried about the legalities. I'm thinking about the boys." Her sons, now 17, were spending the evening with Nadine's sister in Decatur. They knew their parents' marriage was ending. She had told them privately, in careful terms, explaining only what they needed to understand. They had taken the news with the particular resilience of teenagers who had, perhaps, sensed the truth long before it was spoken. "They'll be okay," Rose said. "They have you, they have us, and they have the truth." Nadine thought about this. The truth. It was a simpler thing than she had expected. Once spoken, Marcus had believed he could construct a reality from lies and manipulation, and for 15 years, That construction had held. But lies require maintenance. They require constant attention, constant reinforcement, constant protection from the inconvenient intrusions of fact. She had simply stopped maintaining his lies for him. In the weeks that followed, Marcus signed the divorce papers without contest. The forensic report remained confidential, shared only with his attorney as leverage. His partnership at Henderson & Locke was dissolved by mutual agreement, the firm unwilling to associate with someone whose financial improprieties had been so thoroughly documented. Veronica Tate returned to Charleston. Her hopes of a new life with a successful businessman evaporated. Nadine did not follow these developments with satisfaction. She followed them with the same calm attention she had brought to the entire process, observing, documenting, ensuring that justice proceeded in its proper course. 6 months after the anniversary party, the divorce was finalized. Nadine retained the house, which she promptly sold, using the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students from the communities her development projects had served. She moved with her sons to a smaller house in her old neighborhood in East Atlanta, a few blocks from the apartment where she had lived when she met Marcus. She returned to her work at Brooks and Associates, but with a new focus. She took over the company's community investment portfolio, directing resources toward programs that supported women escaping abusive and manipulative relationships. She partnered with legal aid organizations to provide free representation for those who could not afford it. She built quietly and methodically a structure of support for others who found themselves in positions she understood intimately. Her sons graduated from high school and went on to college, Elijah Jr. to Morehouse, David to Howard. They visited their father occasionally, but the relationship was strained. Marcus had rebuilt some semblance of a career in a smaller firm in Savannah, but he was diminished, his confidence hollowed out, his ambitions reduced to mere survival. Nadine did not hate him. She had passed through hate in the months of preparation, burned through it in the cold clarity of her planning. What remained was something more like pity, the recognition that Marcus Holloway had been offered something genuine and had been unable to see it. One evening, almost a year after the divorce was final, Nadine sat on her back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her father called, as he often did, to check on her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm not holding up," she replied. "I'm standing up. There's a difference." He chuckled. "That sounds like something I might have said." "You did say it, when I was 12 and upset about losing a spelling bee. You told me that holding up meant waiting for things to get better. Standing up meant making them better yourself." "Did I? I was smarter than I remembered." They talked for a while longer about family matters, business concerns, the ordinary fabric of life continuing its weave. When they said goodbye, Nadine remained on the porch, watching the light fade. She thought about silence, about the years she had spent observing, waiting, preparing. Some might call it passive, some might call it weak. But she understood now, more clearly than ever, that silence was not absence. It was presence. It was the accumulation of understanding, the gathering of strength, the preparation for a moment when action would be decisive. Marcus had mistaken her quietness for emptiness. He had looked at her modest clothes and her simple car and her unpretentious manner and seen nothing worth respecting. He had never considered that silence might contain intention, that patience might conceal power, that the woman he dismissed as cheap might be the foundation on which everything he valued actually rested. His failure was not just moral, it was perceptual. He had looked at her and seen what he expected to see, what his own limitations allowed him to see. He had never bothered to look deeper. That was the lesson, she realized. Not that patience always wins, not that justice always prevails, but that the way we see others reveals more about ourselves than about them. Marcus had seen a prop, an accessory, a supporting player in the drama of his own success, and in doing so he had revealed that his success was built on blindness, his confidence on ignorance. She had simply opened his eyes at the moment of her choosing. The night had fully arrived now, stars emerging in the darkening sky. Nadine finished her wine and went inside, turning off the porch light behind her. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new opportunities to build something meaningful from the rubble of what had been. She was ready. Months turned into years, and the sharp edges of what had happened at the Monarch Hotel softened into memory. Nadine rarely spoke of Marcus, and when his name arose in conversation, she addressed it with the same composed detachment she brought to any historical fact. Her sons completed their educations and began their own lives. Elijah Jr. in urban planning, David in public health. Both had inherited their mother's quiet intensity and their grandfather's strategic mind. Both understood, without needing to be told, the principles she had tried to model, that character reveals itself over time, that patience is not passivity, that justice requires preparation. Vanessa Clark retired from active practice but remained close to the family. She and Nadine met for lunch every few weeks. Conversations that ranged from legal strategy to gardening to the comfortable silence of old friendship. "Do you ever hear from him?" Vanessa asked one afternoon as they sat in a small restaurant near Nadine's office. "Occasionally." Nadine set down her fork. "He sends birthday cards to the boys. They're polite but empty. I think he's trying to rebuild something, but he doesn't know how. He only ever knew how to perform. Some people never learn the difference between being and seeming." "No, they don't." They finished their meal and parted with promises to talk soon. Nadine drove back to her office, a modest suite in a building her company owned, where she continued the work that had come to define the second act of her life. On her desk sat a framed photograph from her parents' 50th wedding anniversary, taken 2 years after her divorce was final. In it, Elijah and Rose stood together, his arm around her waist, her head tilted slightly toward his shoulder. 50 years of partnership, genuine and unperformed. 50 years of seeing each other clearly. That was what she had wanted with Marcus. That was what she had tested for, waited for, hoped for, and when she finally understood it would never come, she had done what needed to be done. Some nights, alone in her quiet house, Nadine allowed herself to grieve what might have been. Not Marcus specifically, she had let go of him long ago, but the possibility he represented, the hope that a man's words might match his heart, the wish that love could be enough to change someone. But grief was not regret. She did not regret her choices, not her initial hope, not her patient observation, not her decisive action. She had given the marriage every chance to become what it promised. She had watched and waited and finally acted when action was required, and in the end, she had stood up. The anniversary of the night at the Monarch Hotel passed each year without ceremony. Nadine did not mark it on her calendar or dwell on its significance. It was simply a date, a point of transition, the moment when one chapter ended and another began. But sometimes in quiet moments she remembered her father standing up from his table, walking toward the stage with that unhurried certainty. She remembered the stillness of the room, the weight of the words he spoke. She remembered Marcus's face, the collapse of his assumptions, the shattering of his constructed reality, and she remembered her own voice, calm and clear, delivering the truth he had never expected her to possess. "That cheap wife," her father had said, "owns your company." It was not the money that mattered. It was not the ownership or the leverage or the legal advantage. What mattered was the revelation, the moment when Marcus Holloway finally understood that the woman he had dismissed mocked and betrayed, had been watching him all along. She had seen everything, she had understood everything, and she had simply chosen the moment to let him know. That was power, not the power of wealth or position, but the power of perception, the power of someone who sees clearly acting on what they see. Nadine carried that power forward into everything she did. She built programs and partnerships and initiatives that reflected her understanding of the world. Complex, patient, rooted in the belief that justice was possible for those willing to prepare for it. She mentored young women who came to her, seeking guidance, sharing not prescriptions but principles. Watch before you act. Document what you see. Trust your own perception, and never let anyone else's limitations define your worth. Her father had been right all those years ago. Money talks, but wisdom whispers, and in the end, the whisper always carries further than the shout. On a spring evening 5 years after the divorce, Nadine attended a reception at the Atlanta History Center to celebrate the opening of a new exhibit on the civil rights movement. She moved through the crowd with ease, greeting colleagues and friends, her presence commanding without demand. Near the end of the evening, she found herself standing before a photograph she had not seen before. It showed a group of women from the 1960s, organizers and strategists who had worked behind the scenes of the movement, their names largely unremembered, their contributions essential. Invisible architects, the caption read, the women who built the movement from within. Nadine studied their faces, strong and serious and utterly composed. Women who had done what needed to be done without recognition, without credit, without the satisfaction of public acknowledgement. Women who understood that the work mattered more than the applause. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses in Macon while raising 6 children. She thought of her mother, who had supported her father's building of the company while building a home and a family. She thought of herself, standing in a ballroom in a consignment dress, preparing to dismantle the lies of a man who had never bothered to see her. Invisible architects. Yes, that was the tradition she came from. That was the lineage she carried. She left the reception as the crowd thinned, stepping out into the mild spring air. The city glowed around her, alive with possibility, humming with the stories of people seen and unseen, known and unknown. Tomorrow she would return to her work. Tomorrow there would be meetings and documents and the steady accumulation of progress. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities, its own moments of choice. But tonight she would drive home through streets she had known all her life, to a house filled with quiet and memory, and the deep satisfaction of a woman who had claimed her own truth. She had been called cheap. She had been dismissed as simple. She had been mocked before 200 people by a man who should have honored her. And she had stood up. Not with anger, not with violence, not with the dramatic confrontation that stories so often demand. She had stood up with silence and preparation and the patient accumulation of truth. That was her power. That was her inheritance. That was the whisper that would always carry further than any shout. Nadine started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the reception behind. The night stretched ahead of her, calm and unremarkable and full of quiet possibility. She smiled, just slightly, and drove toward home.